Well, I'm recording this in the middle of the horrible coronavirus pandemic, when we need affable diversions as much as possible. And I'm delighted today to say that the Venerable Father Rod Bauer, in my view, a genuinely affable priest, is my guest. Hi, Rod, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you, David. Lovely to be with you.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm really grateful that you've made time for us. Now, Wikipedia says the Venerable Rod Bauer is an Australian Anglican priest and social activist. He is currently the rector of Gosford, Archdeacon for Justice Ministries and chaplaincy in the Anglican Diocese of Newcastle, and lives on the New South Wales Central Coast. I'm glad you live on the New South Wales Central Coast because, as I understand it, the last time I was there, that's where Gosford was.
Yes, it comes in quite handy if you're the rector of Gosford.
Absolutely. Now, I like to try and look after my my listener or listeners, if there's one or two. Now, some people may not know what the word venerable means, so I looked it up. I did think I knew, but anyway, it says that venerable means someone who is accorded a great deal of respect, especially because of age, wisdom, or character. And I think that fits you well, Rod, but you may not agree.
Well, at least I've got the age.
That's fantastic. Well, you have so many people who love what you do. Different reports, something like 65,000 followers on social media.
Mm-hmm. That's on Facebook, yeah.
Yeah, some people say that you also have a lot of death threats. Is that right?
Yeah, no, it died off. My death threats have died off a bit of late, but which is kind of nice. I mean, I used to get I used to worry about being shot by some right-wing activist. Now the most dangerous thing I do is go to Woolies.
Yeah. Well, somebody with a gun certainly prompts a good deal of social distancing.
Yes,
don't you think?
yes. We've had a few of those kind of threats over the years, which the police have dealt with. And, but it kind of, in one sense, it's nice not to have one for a while. But then you kind of wonder, have I lost my touch? Am I not speaking loudly enough into this space?
Well,
it's two-edged sword.
I've admired what you've been doing for many years because, in my view, and I'm these days, I'm still a believer in the gospel, but I'm probably a bit of a lapsed Christian in that I find very few churches and very few Christian leaders, to me, speak the message. There's a lot of, and I think the message is about social justice. It's meant to be good news for the poor, and unfortunately, we seem to have missed that somewhere.
Well, it was the only message of the founder of the firm,
yeah.
and he was very clear about that. He spoke exclusively, really, about what he called the kingdom.
Yes,
and that's a very evocative term because it was actually putting forward an alternative to the empire.
Yes.
The Greek word for empire and kingdom are the same word, and so it was really saying there is another way apart from the Pax Romana, which brought order without justice.
Yes. Yes.
And order without justice is tyranny.
Yeah.
And so not that there's anything wrong with order. Order is good. Because we hear in those great creation myths that the divine actually brings order out of chaos. That's the nature of creation.
Yes.
But order without justice is tyranny, and so there needed to be another element to this empire, this kingdom, and that was the element of justice. And he banged on about that until they got him.
Absolutely, and when you think of the word empire, I mean it's out of favour a little bit. We don't necessarily talk in terms of empire, but empire is, it's power, isn't it? And it's America, the most powerful nation in the world, and we side ourselves with power, and you've even seen that in Christendom, in various churches, you know, the prosperity gospel, which basically says, you know, God blesses you with money, and if you haven't got any money, then you've done something wrong, you know.
Well, it's imperial. It is. I mean, I think in some sense it's a bit of a shame that we don't use those terms anymore, and we use these. I guess we cover this stuff with a veneer of democracy and all that kind of stuff, and it does blind us to the fact that we do deal with empires all the time, and it also, at the moment, is blinding us to the fact that we are part of an empire, the Western Empire, I guess headed up, I guess in many ways by the United States. We are definitely part of an empire in decline.
Yeah.
And until we really embrace that reality, we will go quietly into the night.
I want to talk more about that. I actually watched and then shared your message, was probably from last Sunday, where you were talking about decline of empire and the 7 characteristics and so on. It was 7, I think, wasn't it?
Yes,
I copied them.
Yes,
I copied them out, and I was trying to remember where I got it right. But I've got a little bit of a slideshow. You're not quite as old as me, but you'd remember the pleasure of family slides, wouldn't you?
Oh, indeed, I do.
Absolutely. Well, I'm really planning not to bore you completely. Now, I love that one, but that's your old sign.
Yes, yes, it is. That's probably one of the last of the old sign.
Okay, so was that put up at the beginning of the coronavirus isolation?
Yes, that was nearly 7 weeks ago, when we, because of restrictions on public gatherings, we needed to stop what we normally understand as public worship, and so we had to close the doors.
I started off learning to be a journalist, and religion got in the way, unfortunately.
It does that.
But you're a great headline writer, aren't you?
Well, yeah. Well, the sign is a classic headline. It's built for the world of memes.
Yes,
so
indeed.
It's basically a meme. Yeah. And it's just tailor-made for social media, and especially Twitter.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, of course, but it's a great message. That's what we're meant to have, open hearts to a world in need. Yes. Now, this one got you into a fair bit of trouble, didn't it?
It got me into an enormous amount of trouble. And I have to say that I don't think you should do anything like that without some degree of inner tensions. And I still have inner tensions about that sign. What I was really highlighting, and given that story of Sodom and Gomorrah, which is really I find the whole dynamic utterly fascinating, because here you have a story that's probably in the vicinity of 3,500 years old, and you have a story of the degradation of human beings for political purposes. It was basically military rape.
Yes,
it's kind of what we saw at Abu Ghraib prison.
Yes,
that's what's going on there, and so you have this story, 3,500-year-old story, with a group of people agonising about the ethics of this behaviour.
Yes.
And yet here were we, where our government was degrading other human beings for political purposes, to send a political message, and without the level of agonisation that happened 3,500 years ago. And I found this utterly fascinating and disturbing and all of those things. So when I said that, and I still agonise over doing that, to be honest. But interestingly, the Murdoch media wheeled Tony Abbott out to oppose this, of course.
Yes.
And ironically, Abbott is theologically educated. He trained to be a priest.
Yes.
And so he was probably the only person that knew deeply that he was lying.
Yes. Yes.
He couldn't feign ignorance on this one, because he knew damn well what he was saying wasn't true.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that really was the icing on the cake for me in that sense.
Well, yeah, and look, I understood what you were saying just by saying that. I did see what the dear, merciful, and kind Andrew Bolt said about you.
Yes, yes, yes.
But we'll leave them to their own devices, shall we? Now, this one, I'm not quite sure. This is a photograph of your gardener, you know?
That was during the floods, the rains, not that long ago. And I forget what the caption was now, but clearing out drains or something like that was after a drought was not a burden. It was a real joy to actually have a leaky church roof and drains full of stuff that we had to dig out because it was finally raining, and it was
wonderful. I put it in there, obviously without the caption, simply because, people used to say, and you must have had it over the years, people think that clergy only work one day a week.
Yes.
And of course, now your church is closed, you've got nothing to do, right?
No, nothing at all. Actually, I've discovered that it actually takes more time to run a closed church than it does to run an open one.
Well, there's a lot of work you have to put into everything behind the scenes, and you're doing Zoom, you're doing online church services and things like that, I presume.
Yes, that's right. Yes. Yeah. But if you're on the team, you have to mop the floors. You have to clean. You have to clean the toilets.
Yes. Yeah.
Everyone has to clean the toilets.
Yeah. And that's you. That's you doing the gardening.
Yeah, and I've got to clean the toilets. Everyone's got to clean the toilets because I think it's an essential part of who we are. The toilets at the church are left open for homeless people to use, and that, I guess you can understand, that creates sometimes a bit of a mess.
Yes,
in all sorts of ways. But my theory is, unless you're elbow deep in the shit of the world, then you're not serious about being a priest.
Yeah, and I value that. I think that's quite right. I won't ask you to comment on this, but because it's it's self-explanatory, and I agree with it, and many people do.
Yes, my local cafe owners weren't terribly happy with me because it did cause them some consternation, because the guy in the cafe down the road said, "Oh, for goodness sake, we take that sign down because I'm getting all this flack about the Daily Telegraph." I said, "Well, that's good. No, I won't take it down."
Look, the interesting thing is, at one stage I was taking photographs, and I don't know what I've even done with them, of different church signs where the opposite of what you're doing there. Most of the church signs were about trying to get people to sit on, to come and sit on a pew, hear a service, join in worship or something like that. And then there was also the guilt messages, you're where you're going to spend eternity and all those sort of things. And I always tend to see things from the point of view of the outsider. It's just something to do with, it's in my genes. And those messages never reach people, in my view.
They don't, because I find this, again, fascinating, that people who, generally speaking, use church signs have no concept of who they're communicating to.
Yes.
Because they think they're communicating to people in the pews. Well, they're not. They're actually communicating to people who aren't in the pews.
Yes.
And people who aren't in the pews read that and just see a bad dad joke.
Yeah.
And it just says, look, you guys are so lame, you're so irrelevant, it repels people rather than encourages them to come along and see what you're on about.
Look, I agree fully, and it's a pity really that even some of your detractors don't learn from the skills that you've got. Now, with this one, I am interested because I love this saying. It's obviously, from the Pythons.
From the Life of Brian.
Life of Brian, yes. And tell me now, why did you put that up?
It was in tribute to, and the name has just escaped me for the moment, the Python who died not so long ago.
Oh, of course.
Who played Brian's mother.
Yes.
Oh, my goodness.
Was
Not Terry Chapman.
Terry
Chapman, was it? Anyway, it's just escaped me for the second. But I love the Life of Brian. I mean, I love Python, but I love the Life of Brian because it's so instructive. Because I think if there's a number of interviews of the Python team about this. They wanted to do a biblical spoof of some description. And so they went away and they read the Gospels in order to get some material.
Yes.
And then they came back and said, well, actually, this is quite good stuff. We don't want to, we don't want to diminish this. So let's do a spoof on those who didn't get it.
Yes.
And so Life of Brian is about those who just don't get it. And so, of course, I think it's incredibly insightful. I use those clips in sermons all the time.
And they were so clever, weren't they?
Yes. And so they can play always look on the bright side of life at my funeral.
Yeah, well, I think they need to do it at mine. Now, the point in the Life of Brian, of course, is his friends made more of him than he was making of himself.
Indeed, yes.
Yes. And I wonder about the Christian story. How many times has that happened, and how many times does it happen today that people make more of the story itself, of the life of Christ? There was that thing years ago, which was people wore what would Jesus do things, The point is in most cases, you don't know what Jesus would do. How would you know? Except...
Yeah, I mean, it's clearly, I think it's quite clear that the historical Jesus, would not recognise himself in the modern Christian image of him.
Yes.
There is no doubt about that. Nor would he recognise himself in the later theological construct of him.
Yes.
I'm not saying for a moment that there's not truth in that construct, but I am saying that the historical Jesus would not recognise himself in it.
I have for many years thought of the, can't remember where it comes from now, but it says he came to his own and his own received him not.
Yes, John chapter 1.
Yeah, and I have thought about that for many, many years, and in the sense that if Jesus was to come now, I think his own would be the ones who would receive him not, and I think the world outside probably wouldn't have as much problem with him as they would.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, I find that once you scrape away some of the baggage that people have about institutional religion, if you can have a inquiring conversation about the historical Jesus, then very few people want to argue, except the extreme political right, of course, who want to claim him on with one hand and deny everything he said on the other.
Absolutely.
But I think most people of goodwill think, that's it's the doctrinal baggage they'll reject, generally speaking.
Yeah. Now, this is a much younger looking Rod Bauer. This was the photograph when you first...
photoshopped, yes.
Photoshopped, was it?
I think so. I think they were being very kind to me.
Was that the first sign you put up in the background or not?
Oh, no. That's really the subtitle of the book. Okay. All Justice is Social. Yes, that's a couple of years ago now.
Yeah,
that was released.
Did the book? Did it? I would expect it would have sold very well.
Yes, it went quite well for that period that those things do. They kind of last for about 9 or 10 months and then disappear into the $2 bin out in front. That's the nature of writing. But what I most enjoyed about that was the writers' festivals. I had an absolute ball.
Did you?
Because the publisher, organises you to go to writers' festivals and speak at various things, and you get to spend some time with some incredibly interesting people and make some good deep friendships too.
Are you considering doing a modern an update on it?
Oh, probably not so much an update on that. There's a few things I would like to write if I ever get the time to do that, and there's a few things I want to explore in terms of the dance between humanity and divinity in that sense, and some issues around the feminine divine and so forth. I'd like to write a bit more about that. Yeah.
Wonderful. That would be great. Now, let's come back to some of the social justice stuff. To stimulate the economy, raise New Start.
Yes.
And of course, it looks...
Which is precisely what they did. a few weeks ago.
But only temporarily.
Yes, only temporarily. Although I think it'll be very difficult to go back to the level that it was at. I think politically now that's going to be impossible. Yes.
I do agree with you. I really hope, and the talk that you gave, the sermon you had from last Sunday, addressed some of the issues that concern me greatly, and you weren't being definitive. You weren't saying, well, therefore I'm saying this, therefore this is what's going to happen, blah, 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 blah.
I wish I had that much influence.
Well, Rod, I think most of the people, and I think of TV evangelists and a lot of the real, you talked about celebrity in that talk. Those who reach that status of celebrity, of almost, people worship, they do speak like that. They speak with, an authority that they claim and they don't actually have. Yeah. So, look, I found it very interesting, that talk, and it gave me some encouragement. Some of us are hoping, in fact, many of us, I think, are hoping that our world will not go back to the coldness that we have experienced over these years. And we, the thing that you put up about Dutton, you have your perhaps regrets, or you're still examining yourself over that. But in reality, the treatment that we have administered to people who are already desperate, they were hurting, they'd come from war-torn situations, and we, in the name of Australia, we have treated those people abysmally and spent so much money to do so.
Well, yes, almost now tens of billions of dollars.
Yes, yeah.
On Operation Sovereign Borders. But what we've done in that is we've commodified human beings.
Yes.
For political purposes.
Yes.
And ironically put an astronomically high value on them.
Yeah.
Monetarily.
Absolutely.
And politically. And in so doing, utterly devalue their humanity. And it's an interesting dichotomy, isn't it? You actually, these 2,000 people, we've put a monetary value on them of something in the vicinity of now $18 billion.
Absolutely.
And yet, in order to do that, we have totally impoverished their human dignity.
Yeah.
And I find that it's certainly an equation that doesn't add up. Literally, that doesn't add up.
Yes.
We've denied, something in them and ultimately in ourselves.
Yes, it's the old dynamic of the torturer diminishes the humanity of the person he's torturing, but at the same time he diminishes his own.
Absolutely, yes, and we've diminished ourselves.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So if you want to talk about a little bit about what you were saying on Sunday, I had those 7 points taken out. I can put them up if you like.
Yeah, you put them up. Yeah, if you like. Yeah.
I'll put them up.
These come from a man who rejoices in the name of Glubb, G-L-U-B-B. He was a British general and historian, and he was fascinated with, as a general would be, in the fall of empire.
Yes.
And so he went from the Assyrian Empire right through to the end of, I guess, the end of the British Empire in the late 1950s, and looked at the characteristics of what happens as he saw it over about a 250-year cycle in terms of empire. And it's interesting to note, of course, that we've just celebrated the 250th anniversary, or commemorated, or lamented the 250th anniversary of Cook's arrival. So we're around that time of the French Revolution, the American Revolution. So that Western Empire is, in Glubb's view, heading towards that 250th year cycle.
Yes.
Now, I wouldn't want to interpret many of these things the way I want to qualify that in case someone thinks I'm agreeing with everything Glubb said. I don't, because I think he was a man of his era, and I certainly wouldn't want to interpret some of the things in the way he did.
Yes.
In fact, I find some quite offensive. But I do recognise. So there's the 7 stages that he and so you've got that that exploring. Let's go and explore and see what's out there.
Yep.
Sort of part, and then when we see what's out there, we better take it over and conquer it, and then we'll suck it dry for its value and in commerce, and the more money we get, the more affluent we become. So then we've got the time and the leisure to start pursuing intellectual pursuits,
Yes.
reading books and writing books and so forth. But that leads us into a certain place that unrestrained humanity can often become quite decadent.
Mm. Mm.
And that's kind of what we see in the Western Empire, and of course that leads to eventually the decline and the collapse. And I guess Rome, the Roman Empire, was a classic example of that. But what I find most kind of interesting around what often happens after the collapse of empire is people return to sustainable small community.
Mm.
It's kind of all we got. It's what we've got to do. We've got to start relying on each other again.
Yes.
There isn't the economy to prop up all sorts of other lifestyles, and I think in many ways that's what's happened in the last 8 weeks.
Well, that's what we've been doing, hasn't it?
It's exactly what we've been doing. We've gone back to small communities, often just a family community within the household. We might have reached out through Zoom to another half a dozen people.
Yes.
So we've regained quite a small communal consciousness.
Yes.
You can't buy flour because everyone's baking bread. You can't buy seed because everyone's planting gardens. And all. I mean, I've done it myself. I mean, out here, if I can just move my camera for a moment, there we go. There's my veggie garden so, out in the back. And so we've had quite a, if you study history a little bit, quite a predictable response to this crisis. We've gone back and become really interested in sustainable community. We're starting to ask questions about what do we want to be like when we come out of this? What values do we want to regain and promote when we come out of this? So it's honestly, it's classic end of empire stuff. What happens when the domination system that supported itself through those 7 processes and evolved into, what happens when that domination system starts to fall apart, loses its authority, loses its power.
Absolutely.
And the barbarians start knocking at the door, and all of those kind of things. So, it's just fascinating stuff. It's. I think there is no better time to be conscious of history.
Yes, we have
because
to be.
it teaches us. I think that's why I wanted to float that historical narrative, because I want people to be conscious of history. And so they can plot where we've been, and when you plot that where we've been, you can actually start to see where we're going.
Absolutely.
And take some, and then start to influence and guide and govern. Because we don't want to descend into chaos.
No.
Because order is a good thing.
Yeah.
But order without justice is tyranny. So we want to maintain some order and inject it with some justice.
Yes. I'm going to draw this to a close, but Rod, what I'd like to ask you is whether we can actually do this again and tease out one thing in particular, which is our welfare system. And I think that you will have some very valuable things to say in that area. So if you're happy to come on the journey with me, we can do that one more time.
I'd be delighted.
Wonderful, absolutely. Now, in closing, I did say to you earlier about that TED Talk before we started recording. And I thought it was wonderful, and I will have links to that as well as your sermon from last Sunday in the base.
The scariest 12 minutes and 40 seconds of my 57 years.
How many people were there?
5,000 people.
God.
No safety net. And, it was, I have no memory of it.
Really?
Yes, well, I talk for a living. It doesn't bother me, but the bar is so high.
Wow.
And you're backstage, and one of the stage managers have their hand on your shoulder, and you can hear the introduction, and they say, "Don't move until I lift my hand off your shoulder." The next thing I remember is someone asking me, "Can I get you a glass of water?"
Wow.
And that was when I'd stepped off and walked after I have no memory.
Because I noticed actually watching you that you were actually quite dry in the mouth.
Oh, dry as anything.
Yeah.
Because of nerves. I was really nervous.
Absolutely. Well, look, I did comment. You had one comment underneath that YouTube talk, and I was very moved by it, to be honest. I mean, when anyone, and I've done it. I've told you I spent a number of years in a cult, and I wrote a book with my brother about that. We're about to re-release it as an audio and an ebook. And when you talk about your personal stuff, as you did, you talked about being adopted, and some of the painful stuff as a kid. That's hard, and
yes.
Absolutely.
But it resonates with everybody on some level. Knows the experience of being excluded.
Yeah, absolutely.
Everybody knows that feeling, and no matter how it manifests in their story.
Yeah.
Everybody has felt injustice.
Oh, absolutely.
And so those things actually resonate with our humanity.
Yeah. And look, we could do a whole talk just on that one subject. Robert Tickner, I don't know whether you've caught up with his book, 10 Doors Down, I think it is, about his mother who lived 10 doors down, and he never knew her. He was a minister in the Whitlam government, I think it was, or Hawke government.
Yes, one of them.
He was my boss when I worked at Red Cross. And, he wrote this story about being adopted, so, he would identify. Sadly, the one comment that was put underneath your thing was a guy speaking in religious terms, really, and he was saying, you know, that you were trying to be a people pleaser, and he quoted you from St. Paul, you know, and I, because of that, put my own comment there, and I basically said to him briefly, I just said, I thought, you know, you were very unkind, because he hadn't empathised with the journey that you'd taken.
No. Or heard what I said.
Yeah, or heard what you'd said at all. Yeah. Listen, all the very best, Rod. I'm looking forward to doing this with you very soon. And thank you very much for today.
Look forward to it. Thank you.